This thing is really not a proper workbench. Now, if you follow the channel for a while, you'll know that I had a pretty decent workbench in my shop in Minnesota, but ever since I've come to Denver, I've been doing all my projects on this. So what happened to that old bench? Well, it was decent, but there were some things about it that kind of bugged me and I thought I could do better. At that time, I also thought I'd be further along with my vise concept, the fast travel vise concept. Now, since my update on that one in February, I've had a few more frustrations with it. It's not dead yet. I've actually got some ideas on how to get past the jamming and trouble that I've been having with it. And I'm ready to tear into that again. But it's time to build a serious bench. And at the end of it, if I don't have my own vise, then I'll just bite the bullet and get a twin screw vise, I guess. But one way or another, it's time for a proper workbench.
Okay, so here is what I'm thinking for a workbench. Now, two things that will probably strike you right away is the legs are metal, and I don't have any rails connecting the left and right sets of legs. And so I think some people will be concerned about end-to-end racking. I put this up on Instagram, and people brought up that concern, and I did make one concession, and that's splaying these legs a little bit. That'll help with that issue. Let me hide the wooden portion. You can see the metal hardware that's connecting the legs on each side. And I'm not showing all the fasteners here that would be holding these to the wood. And this can be pretty heavy welds. I think this is enough to keep the bench from racking end to end. But if it's not, then it would be very simple to put these rails in, just weld them in place. That's one nice thing about working with metal. If this was wood and you put it all together and you had end-to-end racking, then it'd be hard to get this joinery cut in. But with metal, you just weld it in. So pretty easy backup plan. And if I have to do this, then that's what I'll do. I predict the next biggest concern that people will have is that the bench will be a bit tippy, like this, because I don't have these legs flush with the edges of the bench, which I just kind of think looks better and also makes this kind of joinery, this knockdown joinery that I'm envisioning, easier to pull off. If that happens, similar to my fix here with the rails, I'll just put some feet on that widens it out. This will definitely be stable. I think the bench is a little busier if I have to do both these. Not the end of the world by any means. I'll certainly do this if I have to, but I'm going to start off without either of those and see if this works. And if it does, I'll just go with it. Now back to the legs not being flush with the edges. I know that conventional and well-established wisdom is that you should do that because you can clamp things to legs. My last workbench was just like this with the legs inset from the edges. I never wished that it wasn't that way. I guess maybe it's just not that big a deal to me. I am thinking that on the rare occasion that I do want to clamp something to legs, I can just make this block. Rare earth magnet on one side, patch of leather on the other, and I can just very, very quickly place this on the leg wherever I want it, and now I have a clamping surface so that I can clamp something to both the tabletop and the leg and hold it in place. So I may or may not make that. If I find that I'm getting frustrated by not being able to clamp things to the leg, I'll just make this block. And that'll just be an easy way to have the look that I want and very quickly be able to do that clamping. So I'll be able to break this bench down and take it apart in smaller pieces. The wood can come off of the metal frame, and then the two halves of the metal frame are joined up with these front to back rails. I'll show you how that works. It's essentially just a threaded rod that goes through both legs with bolts on each side, and then the spacer in the middle, and then I'll just put as much torque as I can on these nuts to really squeeze these together. You notice that I'm envisioning welding another larger sleeve into each of the legs. That does two things. If I'm really going to clamp these down, I don't want to crush and deform this tube steel. The other thing, if I make sure that the inside of this tube steel is completely sealed off, then I can fill it up with sand, each of these legs up with sand, and get another 100 pounds into the workbench, which is important, especially if I'm skipping rails and a lot of things that would be adding mass. So that's a pretty easy way and cheap way to get a bunch more weight and maybe even impact deadening into the workbench if I'm able to fill these up with sand. But I honestly think the most interesting thing that I'm thinking about are the bench dogs. Now, the first question that I wrestled with was square or round. And I like using hold downs like this that use a round hole. So if I went with square dogs, then I'd have to also have round holes for these hold downs. So that was kind of an automatic, you know what, I'm just going with round dogs. That way I can use the same holes and I don't have Swiss cheese workbench going on. But the square pegs are nice because they can lift up and stay in place if you're clamping something that just works better with the dogs raised up. So how to accomplish that with round dogs, and I know some people put a spring in it and tried to do something similar to the square ones, but I thought of something a little bit more interesting. Let's just dive down in here. So the dowel of the dog is metal, and this contrasting wood inlaid band is not just decorative. It has magnets in the bottom here that will hold this dowel in place. Pretty easy thing to set up and do, so long as it works. Now, I'm not confident enough in this solution to just build the bench and hope it works. I'm going to build a mock-up of that and see how it performs. So let's take a look at that. So I start with a block of wood that's going to represent a small portion of the workbench, and I'm just going to make one dog just to test out that magnet idea. And I first start by routing a slot for the contrasting piece of wood that will hold the magnet. And this process is going to be similar to what I do on the entire workbench, except since all the dogs are in 2 lines, this will be a common procedure for all of them. And then I drill and glue in the magnet into that darker wood. And then glue it in place and make sure I know the location of the magnet so that I can get the dog hole in the right spot. And then I make the dog just cut a circular piece of wood and affix it to a piece of metal pipe. And I cut a flat surface. This is what is going to register against a workpiece. Now, this isn't very pretty, but the important thing is the dimensions are right and it's about the right weight, so it's good enough for testing this out. Now, in the workbench representation block, I drill the larger hole first, make sure I get the depth right, and then drill the smaller hole. I'm about 1/8 of an inch away from the magnet, so I'm not relying on being super close to it. But it's a pretty powerful magnet, and I think it's going to work. And since I'm doing this voiceover after I've already seen it works, spoiler alert, it works. Now I'm cutting a second recess. This will also be the same contrasting wood. What this is going to do is give me good zero clearance against that flat spot on the top of the dog so that I don't have any recesses in the workbench when the dog's down. And here we go. So I can set it any rotation, any height, and it just stays in place like it's supposed to. Now I want to make sure that I have some margin for error, and half of these aren't going to fail. So I put quite a bit of extra weight on top of this and move it around, and it still stays in place fine. This is enough to give me confidence in it, so I think I'm going to go ahead with this bench design.
Well, I hope you found this bench design concept interesting, and I'd certainly like to hear any comments, feedback, thoughts, whatever, about the design from you in the comments. And if you want to follow along as I build this bench, hit that subscribe button or that bell button for notifications, and watch for the next video, where I'll probably glue a bunch of boards together.